Alaska's economy largely depends on oil extraction from its reserves, which has significantly contributed to the state's wealth. However, these reserves are depleting rapidly. As Alaska is the largest oil producer for the United States, the decline in its oil supply raises concerns about the future of both Alaska and the US. What will happen when the oil runs out? First of all, let's understand Alaska's dependency on oil. Now, let's start with the basics. Alaska's relationship with oil. For decades, oil has been the lifeblood of Alaska's economy. If you are from Alaska or if you have been following the state's development, you probably already know this, but for those who don't, here is a quick overview. In 1968, a massive oil field was discovered at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's north slope. That discovery was a game changer for the state. By the mid 1970s, the Trans Alaska Pipeline was constructed and oil started flowing from Prudhoe Bay down to Valdez. This pipeline became one of the world's largest and most important pieces of energy infrastructure. The effects were immediate. Alaska became an oil powerhouse, and with that came jobs, investment, infrastructure, and perhaps most importantly, revenue. Oil money transformed the state, filling its coffers through taxes and royalties. In fact, as of today, oil accounts for more than 80% of the state's revenue. Without it, Alaska's economy would look entirely different. But here's the catch. Prudhoe Bay's oil production peaked in the late 1980s and it's been declining ever since. And we're now approaching the point where the reserves, the stuff that's been driving the Alaskan economy for half a century, are running out. So what does it mean when oil runs out? It's not like one day the taps will just stop and everything will fall apart overnight. But the decline is real and ongoing. In the 1980s, Prudhoe Bay was pumping out over 2 million barrels of oil per day. Fast forward to today, and that number has dropped to around 500,000 barrels per day. The well is literally running dry. To put that into perspective, that's a 75% decrease in just a few decades. And as oil production continues to fall, Alaska is facing a financial crisis that most people don't see coming. The Alaska Permanent Fund, which was established in 1976 as a way to save a portion of the oil revenues for future generations, is being tapped more and more to cover the state's budget. The idea behind the Permanent Fund was simple: set aside money while the oil boom is happening, so the state has a financial cushion once oil revenues start to dry up. But Alaska has been using that cushion more than it probably should. In recent years, the state has been drawing billions from the permanent fund just to balance its budget. This is a huge red flag because once that fund is depleted, the state will have lost one of its key financial safety nets. Now let's talk about what this means for the people of Alaska. If you live in Alaska or know people who do, you are probably aware of something called the Permanent Fund Dividend or PFD. Every year, a portion of the earnings from the Permanent Fund gets distributed to Alaskans in the form of dividend check. It's basically free money just for being a resident of the state. This dividend has become a huge part of life for many Alaskans. For some families, especially in rural areas, the PFD represents a significant chunk of their annual income. Now imagine what happens when oil production declines and the state can't generate the same kind of revenue anymore. The PFD will shrink or disappear altogether. This is a big deal. It's not just about losing a nice annual check. For many low-income families, especially those in the bush or remote parts of the Alaska, this money is vital for survival. Food, heating, transportation, all of it is incredibly expensive in rural Alaska. And without that yearly check, things could get really dire really fast. It's not just the PFD either. Oil revenues fund everything from education to healthcare to infrastructure projects. With less oil money, state services will inevitably face cuts. Schools might lose funding, roads and public services could degrade. The state government, already struggling with budget deficits, will be forced to make tough choices, cutting essential services or raising taxes. And as we know, raising taxes in a state where the cost of living is already sky high won't be easy. Then there is the issue of jobs. The oil industry is a major employer in Alaska. From engineers to oil rig workers to truck drivers, Tens of thousands of Alaskans rely on oil for their livelihoods. But as production slows, the number of jobs in this sector will shrink. That's already happening. As companies scale back operations and close down oil fields, we're seeing fewer and fewer job opportunities. And here's the kicker: Alaska doesn't have a diverse economy. Unlike other states that might rely on tourism, tech, or manufacturing, Alaska is heavily dependent on oil and gas. When those jobs disappear, there isn't much to fall back on. Sure, fishing and tourism are important, but they are nowhere near enough to replace the kind of economic activity oil brings in. So, what do you do when a whole sector of the economy starts to collapse? Unemployment will rise. Families will struggle. More and more people might start leaving the state in search of better opportunities elsewhere. This could create a vicious cycle where the shrinking population leads to even fewer tax revenues, which leads to more cuts in services, and so on. Another angle to consider is the environmental one. Alaska is ground zero for climate change. The state is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the US, and the impacts are already being felt. Melting permafrost, disappearing sea ice, and increasingly unpredictable weather patterns are wreaking havoc on ecosystems and communities alike. Here's the irony: Alaska's oil production, one of the contributors to global warming, is also one of the industries most at risk from climate change. As the Arctic warms, the infrastructure that supports oil production, like pipelines and roads, becomes more vulnerable. Melting permafrost, for example, can destabilize the ground, putting pipelines and other equipment at risk. And in a state as remote as Alaska, infrastructure failures can be catastrophic. So even if Alaska continues to push for more oil exploration, particularly in places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the environmental and logistical challenges are only going to increase. Alright, I know this all sounds pretty grim, but let's talk about solutions. What can Alaska do to mitigate this crisis? Well, diversifying the economy. This is probably the most obvious and yet the hardest solution. Alaska needs to diversify its economy. Whether it's investing more in renewable energy, Alaska has massive potential for wind, solar, and hydro, or expanding industries like tourism, fishing, or even tech. The state has to find other sources of revenue. Federal support. Alaska has a unique relationship with the federal government, largely due to its geographic and strategic importance. Some experts argue that federal support could help the state weather the storm. This could come in the form of infrastructure projects, defense spending, or targeted economic aid. Tapping into new resources. There is also the possibility of new oil and gas discoveries. Alaska still has untapped resources in places like ANWR and offshore in the Beaufort at Chukchi Seas. But this is controversial. While new discoveries could provide a short-term boost, they come with major environmental and political challenges. Plus, they're not a long-term solution. Eventually, all oil runs out. Improving efficiency. Alaska can also work on becoming more efficient with its remaining oil resources. Investing in technologies that allow oil fields to produce more with less could extend the life of existing fields. This has already happened to some extent at Prudhoe Bay, where advances in drilling technology have allowed companies to squeeze more oil out of the ground than originally thought possible. Permanent fund reform. Another option is reforming how the permanent fund is used. Right now, the state draws a set percentage of the fund's earnings each year. But there are ongoing debates about whether that percentage should be adjusted or if more aggressive savings strategies should be implemented to preserve the fund for future generations. Now let's zoom out for a moment. Alaska's oil crisis isn't just an Alaska problem. It has national and even global implications. Alaska is one of the top oil-producing states in the US, and any major disruptions to its oil production will impact the broader energy market. First, less oil from Alaska means the US will be more reliant on imports. This could lead to higher energy prices, increased volatility in the market, and potentially even geopolitical consequences as the US turns to countries like Saudi Arabia or Russia to fill the gap. Second, Alaska's strategic importance in terms of national security can't be ignored. It's a critical location for military bases, missile defense systems, and Arctic operations. If Alaska's economy falters, there could be a cascading effect on its ability to support these defense initiatives. So what happens when Alaska's oil runs out? The short answer is it's complicated. This state faces a perfect storm of economic, environmental, and social challenges that could redefine life for people who live there. The decline of oil production will affect everything from jobs to public services to the basic cost of living. But there is also an opportunity here. Alaska has the chance to rethink its economic model, invest in new industries, and find a path forward that doesn't rely so heavily on a resource that won't last forever. The road ahead is tough, but it's not impossible. If you want to know why does every product in your home have a tag made in China, then you should watch the video currently displayed on your screen. Goodbye, and I'll see you next time, and bundle of thanks for watching.